Te Koto te whānau o Aotearoa Unitarians. Te Koto nā manahiri. No mai, haere mai. Ki tene hui topa a te atua, tena koto, tena tato katoa. Welcome to you all to our virtual service. Life is, as we know, full of mysteries, challenges, and ethical dilemmas. If our faith does not guide us or promote understanding or move us to action, it is not a faith worth holding. For the last 2 weeks, we've been living a case study of this reality in Aotearoa, New Zealand, forced upon us by the occupation of the Parliament lawn by a minority with a wide variety of agendas. However, they share a belief that civil disobedience is justified, no matter how uncivil it may be. Who is right? Who is wrong? Lucky for us, civil disobedience is a part of Unitarian DNA. One of our Unitarian forebears, Henry David Thoreau, defined what civil disobedience is and is not. He may help our understanding. This morning, I invite you to reflect with me on civil disobedience and its importance to democracy. We'll begin by an opening song, a song you all know well. If you have a candle or a chalice, this is the time to bring it out. This fire is a reminder of the light within us all, the yearning for freedom, the longing for truth, the flame of intuition, the torch of conscience. We dedicate this service to the remembrance of this holy light. As a last candle, I light a virtual candle for all those joys and concerns in our hearts and minds. And especially at the moment for all those impacted by the pandemic, the spike in cases here in New Zealand. But moving on. Civil disobedience is about exposing injustice. Speaking truth to power remains a crucial role of all people, the poet, in the face of political and media rhetoric designed to obscure and manipulate, or worse. For our reading, I offer a selection of poems that call out and talk back to the inhumane forces that threaten from above. They expose grim truths, raise consciousness, and build united fronts. The first is by noted poet Maya Angelou, And Still I Rise. Two of the poems are by slam poets. I don't know if you've heard of slam poetry. It's a form of performance poetry that combines the elements of performance, writing, competition, and audience participation. It is performed at events called poetry slams, or simply slams. The name slam came from how the audience has the power to praise or sometimes destroy a poem and from the high energy performance style of the poets. The concept of slam poetry originated in the 1980s in Chicago, when a local poet and construction worker, see, anybody could be a poet, Mark Kelly Smith, feeling that poetry readings and poetry in general had lost their true passion, had an idea to bring poetry back to the people. He created a weekly poetry event, the Poetry Slam, where anyone could participate. Each of the poems I'm not going to read because the people who wrote them do a much better job. So let's begin with Maya Angelou. Oops. The next one is about racism in of all places, Aotearoa. It's a young slam poet sharing her experience. And the third one is a slam poet in Canada who is concerned about the environment and wants to speak truth. It's entitled, "The Government is Lying to Us." Like the vast majority of Kiwis, I've been unimpressed by the behavior of the anti-maskers, anti-vaccinators, and the anti-mandators, Trump wannabes, neo-Nazis, Jacinda haters, and miscellaneous malcontents, creating chaos in Wellington for nearly 2 weeks. Protesting is a justifiable activity in a democracy. Sometimes that protesting leads to civil disobedience, which is an essential force for bending the arc of justice. The question I have been mulling over is, can what is happening in Wellington be considered civil disobedience or uncivil disruption of the peace? I have to be careful about throwing too many stones. 5 years ago this past week, Auckland Unitarians committed civil disobedience when we offered sanctuary to Indian students the government wanted to deport. Sanctuary was once common law. It prevented authorities from arresting anyone who claimed sanctuary in a church. Its intended purpose was to give time to negotiate a just resolution to the conflict. Sanctuary is no longer provided for in the law, so we acted in an illegal manner by protecting the students. The only reason police did not enter the premises, as the law allowed, to arrest the students is that it would have looked bad on TV. The other reason I need to be careful in my stone tossing is that a short address by Unitarian Transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau popularized the idea of civil disobedience, although it took 70 years before the world noticed it. Embracing civil disobedience ever since has been a defining quality of our movement. The address was the result of Thoreau walking into Concord from his cabin on Walden Pond to go to the cobbler. Seen by the local constable, he was stopped and arrested for failing to pay his poll tax for the previous 3 years. Not wanting to arrest Thoreau, the constable offered to lend him the money to pay it. Thoreau refused, as he did not want to support a government that endorsed slavery and had dreams of fulfilling its manifest destiny by annexing Texas through war with Mexico. He only spent one night in jail as someone anonymously paid his tax for him. He was never sure who, but it is thought it was his Aunt Maria, who was scandalized by having her nephew in jail. Thoreau demanded he not be released as he had not paid the tax himself. The constable disagreed and kicked him out of jail when he refused to leave. Thoreau continued to not pay the tax. I should note that the tax supported civic functions and did not fund state or federal expenditures, such as the Mexican-American War. For Thoreau, that was inconsequential. It was a symbolic political act of civil disobedience against governmental injustice and a call for action. Thoreau's act of civil disobedience and his subsequent address on the subject has spawned a library of books, countless academic articles, university courses, and plays, while inspiring the suffragettes, environmentalists, the LGBTQ community, indigenous peoples reclaiming their rights and land, French peasants, unionists, and more specifically, Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March that freed India from British rule, and Claudette Colvin. At the age of 15, schoolgirl Claudette Colvin became the first African American to refuse to give up her seat to a white woman on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Colvin stated she felt the hands of abolitionists Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth holding her down. She was dragged from the bus and subjected to sexist and racist behavior before being arrested and held in an adult jail. Following the arrest of Rosa Parks 9 months later for the same action, the Women's Political Council, a group of Black women working for civil rights, circulated 50,000 flyers calling for a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. As news spread of the boycott, African American leaders across Montgomery, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., began to lend their support, and the American Civil Rights Movement was born. It's important to this discussion to understand the context motivating Thoreau not to pay his taxes. The two major issues being debated in the U.S. during Thoreau's life were slavery and the Mexican-American War. By the late 1840s, slavery had driven a wedge in American society, with a growing number of Northerners expressing anti-slavery sentiments. In the 1850s, the country became even more polarized with the introduction of slave-friendly laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Law. In addition to this domestic conflict, the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 proved a point of much contention, precipitated by boundary disputes between the U.S. and Mexico. The war was ultimately fought in order to expand American territory, and as a result, the U.S. gained much of the present American Southwest, including California, Nevada, and Utah. It also added Texas as another slave state to the Union. Thoreau and other opponents of the war argued that the campaign constituted an unnecessary act of aggression, and that it was pursued on the basis of arrogance rather than any philosophically justifiable reason. At the time, the vast majority of Americans expressed their support of slavery and the war by electing James Polk president. Polk was a proponent of both. In justifying his civil disobedience to slavery and the war, Thoreau asserts that government is best which governs least, or governs not at all. He argues that government should function as the will of the people dictates, rather than in the interest of a powerful few. He calls not for an end to all government, but for a better government, and insists that changes toward that end be implemented immediately. Thoreau then invites Americans to consider what kind of government would command respect and to insist on obtaining that ideal. He questions why people have consciences if they do not act on them, but instead relegate moral authority to their legislators, as the government requires. People should not be subjects. They should object to such immoral government policies. If the government or companies are run by people of conscience, he continues, then they will become conscientious, responsible institutions. Thoreau cautions against obeying the law for its own sake. People should not follow leaders blindly, but should instead question authority. It is more important to cultivate a respect for what is right than for the law. If the law or government action is unjust, citizens have a moral responsibility to oppose it. Thoreau then questions the notion of majority rule, arguing that it does not ensure that the government will do what is right, but rather that it will do what is popular. In Thoreau's view, people must be willing to do what is unpopular, to cast independent votes, and to act against injustice. Thoreau does end the essay optimistically, saying that if individuals respect one another and are regarded by the state as her source of power rather than her slaves, true democracy will occur. Whereas Thoreau understood the civil in civil disobedience to characterize the political relations between civilian subjects and their civil government, today most scholars and activists have gone further and understand civil to relate to civility, a kind of self-restraint necessary for concord under conditions of pluralism. The central features of Thoreau's approach to civil disobedience, as interpreted today, are: first, for an act to be civilly disobedient, it must involve some breach of law. An act of law-breaking must be deliberate, principled, and conscientious, if it is to be civil and hence distinguishable from ordinary criminal offenses. Civil disobedience cannot be unintentional. It must be undertaken deliberately. Principled disobedience can be distinguished from ordinary criminal offending by examining the motives that underlie the disobedient act. The person must intend to protest laws, policies, institutions, or practices that they believe are unjust on the basis of their sincerely held moral or political commitments. The deliberate and principled features of civil disobedience are often brought together under the umbrella of conscientiousness and equated with seriousness, sincerity, depth of conviction, and selflessness, again in order to contrast civil disobedience with criminal lawbreaking. What makes an act of disobedience civil? Scholars commonly considered all or some of these and found 5 features to define civil disobedience. The first, communication. Typically, a person who commits an offense has no wish to communicate with their government or society. In contrast, civil disobedience is understood as a communicative act, a kind of symbolic speech, which aims to convey a message to a certain audience, such as the government and public. Civil disobedience are thought to contribute arguments to the public sphere. Typically, their message is a call for reform or redress, and their audience is the majority. The next is publicity. On many accounts, civil disobedience must be not only communicative, but also public in a specific way. Publicity may designate different features: the openness of the act, non-anonymity of the agents, advance warning of planned actions, responsibility taken for the action, or an appeal based in publicly shared principles of justice. The next feature is nonviolence. Like publicity, nonviolence is supposed to be essential to the communicativeness of a civilly disobedient act, nonviolence being part of its legibility as a mode of address. John Rawls put it this way: to engage in violent acts likely to injure, and to hurt is incompatible with civil disobedience as a mode of address. Indeed, any interference with the civil liberties of others tends to obscure the civilly disobedient quality of one's act. The next feature is non-evasion. Civil disobedience are standardly expected to take responsibility for and accept the legal consequences of their lawbreaking. Their evading punishment would make their acts ordinary crimes or acts of rebellion. Their willingness to invite punishment is supposed to demonstrate their endorsement of the legal system's legitimacy and their intense concern over the issue at hand. The next feature is decorum. In some views, being civil means the civil disobedience behave in a dignified and respectful manner by following the conventional social scripts that spell out displays of dignity and ways of showing respect in their society. Some theorists understand civility itself as respect for minimal civil norms. Decorum may be understood to prohibit conduct that would be seen as offensive, insulting, or obscene. The next feature is fidelity to law. What makes an act of civil disobedience special? On some accounts, an act that satisfies the criteria of civility, especially non-evasion, signals disobedience, respect for, and fidelity to the legal system in which they carry out their protest, in contrast with ordinary offenders and revolutionary agents. So, that's an in-depth view of civil disobedience and what it means. And it's quite clear when you read through just a sampling of the vast amount of material regarding civil disobedience that Thoreau opened a can of worms with his address. To this day, there is considerable debate about these specific requirements for an act of disobedience to be civil. But they do provide a starting point for our musings about what is happening in Wellington. The answer as to whether or not it constitutes civil disobedience is not as clear-cut as we might first have thought. I am going to play my last song. It's from the movie Harriet Tubman, and it's called Stand Up. There's much of that song that resonates with Thoreau's civil disobedience. My closing words are by Robert Kaufman. We have come together to share our deepest concerns, speaking and singing words of inspiration and hope. We have committed ourselves to do what we can to ease the burdens of those who suffer, to stand for decency and compassion. We have pledged to work for a more wholesome environment for us and for all the generations that will follow. But these are just words. The hymns we sing are just songs. All our reflections are just idle thoughts. When we convert them all into loving and responsible action throughout the week, then and only then will this morning become what we want it to be, a time of worship. And now if you have a chalice, it's time to extinguish it. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Okay, it's time for our breakout groups. Here's the question. Is what's happening in Wellington civil or uncivil disobedience? You will notice I didn't answer that question in my musings. So is what's happening in Wellington civil or uncivil disobedience?